Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'd like to begin, as we always do, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all of the lands on which the participants in this webinar find themselves. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any other Aboriginal elders who are here with us today. And for our friends in New Zealand, ena mana, ena reo, ena karanga tanga maha, tēnā koutou katoa. Perhaps even more than usual, this acknowledgement feels important today. First Nations peoples are the world's first storytellers. Stories and dreaming from First Nations community capture the worldviews and ways of understanding that should be valued and recognised by everyone. So we want to acknowledge First Nations people's ancient connection with storytelling and how it shapes our world and our connections to it. I'm so happy to be hosting this webinar today. I was saying to the panelists and my colleagues before, I often sit behind the scenes of these webinars, so it's wonderful to actually be facilitating the conversation today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Thea. I'm the Director of the Centre for Public Impact in Australia and New Zealand, and I'll be hosting today's conversation. Stories are such a powerful force in society, and it was such a privilege for me to learn more about the role of storytelling as a force for change in the work that CPI did with the Dusseldorp Forum and Hands Up Mallee on this topic earlier this year. And I'm really looking forward today to delving more deeply into some of the questions and ideas that emerged through that process and exploration. To give you a sense of what we're going to be doing today, we're going to begin this session with a story from each of the panelists. And then we're going to move on to an interactive component, which is not a breakout room, where we're going to be asking you, our audience, to share what storytelling looks and feels like for you. We're then going to spend about 20 minutes where I'll be asking the panelists questions, and then we're going to move on to your questions. And in the spirit of experimentation, what we're actually going to do today is I'm going to hand to audience members to turn on their cameras and their videos and their microphones and ask the panelists questions themselves. We don't have breakout rooms today because we have heard from you that they don't work for everyone. And because of that, we're going to finish on the hour. So we'll finish at 1 o'clock rather than 1:15. A couple of technical things. We do ask that you stay on mute. You're welcome to have your video on or off, whatever works for you. The webinar is being recorded and will be published afterwards with captions. As always, we'd love you to tweet using the hashtag #ReimagineGov. And we'd really invite you to start adding comments and questions into the chat from the moment we begin, so any time from now. So that's enough from me. We're going to dive straight in. I do want to say that Skye Trudgett, who is one of our panelists here today, who I'll hand to in a minute, has come along despite being very unwell. She herself is unwell, and she has a little person with her at home as well who is also unwell. So we're so grateful that Skye came, but Skye's going to tell her story. Then I'm going to ask Skye the first question as part of the panel conversation, and then Skye's going to drop off the call so she can go and have some lemon tea and a bit of a snooze, because that's what it sounds like she needs. So Skye, we will start with you. Thanks again for making the effort to come. And can you tell me a bit about the story behind who you are and why it is that you're speaking with us today?
Thank you, Thea. Just 1 minute. Okay, yeah, 1 second. So my name is Skye Trudgett. I am a Kamilaroi woman. My family come from a small town in Walgett, which is New South Wales, but I grew up in Dubbo and Wiradjuri country, and I now live here on a Awabakal country in Newcastle. I think my story really starts around why I'm here. When I was first in research, I was doing oncology clinical trials. And then I took a break to have my first child and moved out to Bourke. And when I moved out to Bourke, I was lucky enough to spend some time at Marinuka. And it was there that I really started to understand the power of storytelling, and that the voice of community is so important in making social change. And so I quickly realised that I had no interest in moving back over here to Newcastle and going back into clinical research. And so I stayed in this space of trying to continue to learn from community and center the voice of community in ways that goes beyond, one moment, a survey, and your standard kinds of approaches, and really kinds of centers voices through storytelling. And so that, people even like this fella can have their voice heard. And I think that's the really important part of storytelling. So thank you, Thea.
Thank you so much, Skye. Rachel, we'll pass to you now to tell us your story about storytelling.
Sure. I'm really glad we get to introduce ourselves, because it's an opportunity to share a storytelling framework that I actually learnt several years ago as part of the Black Card course developed by Dr. Mary Graham and Dr. Leela Watson, who are Aboriginal elders and educators and long-time lecturers for the University of Queensland. It's based on 40,000 years of experience of hundreds of Aboriginal nations maintaining complex, sophisticated social practices and relationships with each other and the land. Dr. Graham says that there is no Aboriginal equivalent to the notion of I think, therefore I am, but if there were, it would be I am located, therefore I am. The land and how we treat it is what determines our humanness, says Dr. Graham. Because land is sacred and must be looked after, the relationship between people and land becomes a template for society and social relations. So to begin good relations with you all here today, I'm going to share where I was born and grew up, the traditional owners of that land and what happened to them, details about my family, the languages I speak, and where I feel is most home to me. So my name's Rachel Fyfe. I was born on Kaurna country in Adelaide in the Queen Victoria Hospital, across the road from the Victoria Park racetrack, where apparently my father was placing a bet on a horse race at the moment of my birth. I was raised on Barkindji country in Broken Hill in far west New South Wales until I was 10, and that experience was so formative that it's still the place that I call home. The traditional owners of the land on which I was raised are the Barkindji people, where different clans had different names. The people that lived on the hills had different names to those that lived on the Darling River, but most are considered to be river people. Despite the truths of colonisation, the disease, the massacres, displacement, and the continued racism, the Barkindji survive. In 2015, they won the largest native title determination in New South Wales, covering 128,000 square kilometres from Wentworth at the Victorian border to near Wanaring in the state's northwest, including Broken Hill, Wilcannia, Menindee, Pooncarie and Dareton. Their claim took 18 years. My mother, brother, sister-in-law, niece and nephew live in Adelaide, and while my parents and grandparents were born in Australia, my great-grandparents immigrated from rural Ireland, Scotland and England, escaping famine and poverty. They eventually settled in the middle of the Australian outback to work as miners for a fledgling BHP. I now live on what is considered to be Garigal land on the northern beaches of Sydney, although there's a lot of uncertainty as to the traditional owners of that specific area, as most of the clans died during the early years of first contact and the traditional owners are not recorded. I live with my 14-year-old son Jet and 11-year-old daughter Olive and husband Trent. We spend most of our time surfing, mountain biking, bushwalking and enjoying the lake. I speak terrible French even after 8 years of school lessons, pretty good English with a hint of a British accent after 5 years of living and working in the UK in my 20s. I've been picking up small phrases from different Aboriginal languages as I travel and work around Australia, most recently learning some Gulwinku and some Larrakia. To me, home is still the red dirt of Broken Hill, where I feel most connected to nature, community and family. For me, it's also the place where great storytelling influenced the path that I took as I grew older. In the 80s, it was all about TV, and in Broken Hill, there were just 2 television stations, which is a fact that horrifies my children. It just happens that one of those was the ABC. My mother and my aunt were both school teachers, so I grew up on a diet of the ABC current affair programs every Sunday night at my grandparents' house. Reporters in flak jackets or with exotic headscarves draped over their heads, telling stories of places and people fighting oppression and injustice just blew my tiny town mind. It was TV journalism that really shifted the way that I saw the world, what was possible, and most importantly, what wasn't right. This led me to work in communications for organisations that are working towards a better society, which is what I've been spending my time on for over 15 years now. And that's me.
Beautiful story. Thank you so much, Rachel. And Simon, I'm going to pass to you now.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Simon Goff, and I am dialing in from Gadigal country of the Aotearoa Nation down in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. That is, I will also start with like where I'm originally from. This is not where I'm from. I grew up near the town of Brighton on the South Downs in the south of England. And I'm in my mid 40s. I grew up through the late 70s and 80s, and was always sort of aware of the privilege that I had in my upbringing. And similar to Rachel, I had that experience of seeing the world through the lens of journalism, through the lens of the conflicts that were sort of overtaking our TV screens, and in those formative years of my teenage years. But really, like where I am now, I'm going to talk about three things. So three things that have sort of landed me where I have got to in my life and my career, and they are things that don't necessarily have much commonality. So the three things are the band U2, the windsurfing, and Xanadu. Not Xanadu, the Olivia Newton-John song, but Xanadu, the former summer palace of Kublai Khan, which is in Inner Mongolia, about 150 k's north of Beijing. And how do all of those things combine to end up like in the story of me? So I will explain. And they are relevant to what my career has been, which is the combination of storytelling and social change, and how those things come together in order to shape better outcomes and to have like impact in the world on some of the pressing issues that we're facing and communities are facing. So I was an avid fan of U2, and literally could recite all of their lyrics, write everything, all of those, like, it's kind of like deeply uncool at the time, but like that's what it was. But I used to sort of read all the liner notes, and at the back of every, at the bottom of the lyrics and the tiny print on all of the CDs was a link to Amnesty International and their support of that, and their promotion, obviously not very good promotion since it was written so small at the bottom of their liner notes, but their promotion of human rights causes. And that was like an access point to not just like seeing what I was seeing on the news, but also like that there were people out there doing something about it. There were institutions and organizations that were mobilized and organized to actually address some of the challenges, right, around human rights. The windsurfing piece comes because I grew up by the ocean and was an avid windsurfer and loved the ocean. And the access point there was an organization called Surfers Against Sewage. And that sort of inspired my interest, like through the lens of sport and through the lens of my interest, connected to me to the sort of like the conservation of the oceans and the environment through there. So the stories about that is that like they were access points that made these stories relevant. It was the use of culture, it was the use of sport, it was the use of things that actually brought to life to me what was happening, right, and gave me a language and a community and a way to actually engage with those issues. And Xanadu was a bit sort of that culminates and brings things together, because I went on a journey and made a travel documentary of my journey to Xanadu, where I had started in Istanbul and traveled through Central Asia. And it was on that journey that really taught me to like bring together the storytelling and the role of storytelling and the impact that can have. And that ultimately took me to actually worked for Amnesty International for a time, and then onto MTV, where I worked on youth-focused social impact campaigns, and now an organization called Purpose that works to engage and mobilize audiences around critical issues.
Wonderful. Thank you, Simon. And 3 sort of very different, but all very beautiful stories about how you've come to storytelling in different ways. So Skye, I'm going to come back to you so that you can then go and have your tea. But I'd just love you to share a little bit with our audience around the question of storytelling and evidence. So what can storytelling do that other forms of evidence can't necessarily do? And what gets in the way of them being valued as a valid form of evidence? So we'll have this question and then we'll move to the word cloud. I'm just conscious of letting you drop off, Skye. So can you talk to that question?
I can, thanks, Thea. I think for me, there's within stories, I think we understand emotion and feelings, and the things that really get to the crux of why things are important to people and to communities. So for instance, some of the work that we've been doing down in Victoria at the moment has been with a group in August who have gone through significant trauma. And so in their stories, we really get to understand what is the trauma that's being reignited from bushfires, from floods, from colonization. How are those things coming back through? And you can really hear that and feel that in the stories that people are providing. Those stories are so incredible and moving for anyone who kind of comes into contact with them, and they hold the voice of the people that are giving their story. So in a way that actually, you know, they're asking for that to be delivered. So we receive it in that same context. And what we kind of see then is what's required around reporting is often something very different. So maybe it's around how many jobs are now secured from this initiative, or how many people think this, or how many people are now finishing school because of a well-being initiative that's in community. But it's actually not about that at all. And so the numbers are really losing sight of why people are turning up, why these things are really important. And so I think that stories really pull other people in and they speak to the truth. So it allows for that truth-telling opportunity that's significant. And I think that there's so many other wonderful examples in First Nations communities around starting to think of storytelling and truth-telling as the foundation for social change. You know, we've done a lot of work that's looking at big population level measures, but it's just not really talking to what's actually happening on the ground. I think that storytelling helps bypass that challenge and gets right into what's really going on. I think that the reason that, so I think, I don't know, it's really tricky. Like storytelling is valued, and kind of everyone who comes into contact with a story cannot deny the emotion that comes from that story, or feeling like you're connecting with a person or a community and what's really going on. But then it kind of like goes into this reporting piece of like, that's lovely, I feel really connected to that, but then I want these numbers, or but it doesn't fit in my evaluation framework, or but this, rather than doing, I guess, the hard work of going, actually, this is talking to truth and what's really going on. And as evaluators, or as government, or as whoever we are in this system, we have a responsibility of resisting this requirement around numbers and centering exactly what's actually going on for community. I think if we were able to do that and find a way past relying on numbers alone and finding this healthy balance, then we would actually be able to not make more change, but I think we would be able to build a really big evidence base of social change that others can learn from in a really like engaging way. I think that stories, again, is just this other opportunity for us to learn from each other too. Sorry, Thea, I feel like I haven't got everything all together in my head, and it's like not coming out as much as I would have liked to. But is there any other pieces to that question? Like, I'd love to hear what Rachel and Simon think too.
Yeah, agree. Rachel and Simon, would love you to jump in.
Skye, you know, I've heard you talk about this before, and it's really kind of resonated with me, that often we're looking at success through an economic lens rather than a holistic one, that takes into account all the complexity of the things that human beings need to thrive. And often that's a real blocker to, you know, really valuing storytelling and evaluation.
I agree.
Yeah, it's the trends I've seen over the past sort of 20 years, where actually the role of data and the all-encompassing sort of direction towards it has been detrimental in some respects, right? Because it sucks up all of the oxygen around everything, like at the expense of, you know, more qualitative approaches that are like, you know, actually involving community. And when you boil everything just down to numbers and data, it loses meaning, right? And so I think that, like in our work, we try to bring like mixed approaches, like to address that. But of course, it's also become very multidisciplinary, like the role of data and the individuals and the expertise within that creates an environment where you're then dealing with very different skill sets and individuals. And it's like, how do you find connective tissue? It becomes like like on a sort of project level, how are you actually bringing together quite different skill sets and individuals towards like common goals around what we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, and I think that storytelling just makes things so accessible. One of the things that we had been trying, well, the team in Burke were really leading, is around this truth-telling approach to determining whether local initiatives are gaining the traction or seeing the results that they would like to see. So instead of relying on numbers alone, it was conversations with others within the collaboration about how we set these expectations. Here are some things that we might be seeing within our community, if that was actually happening or not. And they're really visible things that, one, the collaboration could see, but community could also see. So it maintains that accountability in place. And just the level of buy-in and engagement around actually having a conversation. So this is for members of the collaboration who are working tirelessly, you know, on the ground, having a conversation and saying, yeah, we are or we are not seeing that thing, and putting a bit of context around it, or, you know, barriers or enablers that might be there. That's easily done, and it's relying on a person's local knowledge and their expertise, as opposed to then asking them, can you dismiss that and go and dig out numbers? So we often see there'll be heaps more buy-in around the storytelling process of gathering data, but less so in terms of then collating and submitting numbers. So I think I thought that was a great way that you framed that, Simon, in terms of it sucks all the oxygen, like this requirement to then go and get data, put it in somewhere else. It sucks all the oxygen out. And I think at some point, I can't believe I'm going to say this publicly, but at times when I have had to report on numbers, I remember just being like, I just put a 4 in this month. It's in next month, you know, like, because I didn't engage with it. I didn't buy in. Didn't mean anything. And so it became far from the truth, as opposed to where storytelling is giving the truth. I think it's really valuable.
And that's such an interesting point, Skye, because I think that one of the challenges that we often face with using stories as evidence is that people see stories as being more subjective than numbers. You know, numbers are a more objective form of capturing data. So I think that point that you make is fascinating.
Yeah. And I've said that to a couple of people, not so publicly, and they're like, yeah, I did that too. So then oh no.
I think it's exactly the same in communications work. You know, you measure how many views a post had on Facebook, or how many, and it means nothing. Like it's raw data that really isn't telling you how people felt about it, or whether they engaged or went on to do anything. So, you know, that kind of data is not very helpful.
So true.
Skye, I'm going to let you jump off the call. Thank you so much for your generosity in being here, and we hope that you and your little one feel better soon. So thank you.
Thanks so much, guys. I'm so sorry. Have a good day, though.
Thanks, Skye.
See you.
Bye.
So we're actually going to take a pause now from questions. I just wanted to make sure that Skye could rest as soon as possible. And we're going to ask you, the audience, to contribute your thoughts for a moment. So Shannon is going to put a link into or a QR code into the screen. You can see it there. And the question that we want you to answer is, what does storytelling look and feel like for you? So you can scan that QR code, or you can type that polev.com into your browser and share with us what storytelling looks and feels like for you. We'll just give you a moment to do that, and then we'll start showing the results. That's the QR code one more time if anyone wants it. And Shannon, I think we're ready to look at the results. There we go. So we've got connection, truth popping up as strong themes. Connection, it's really interesting. Real. Compassion. I'll drop the link. Tony, you've got the link. Understanding, inspiring, empathetic, vulnerability. That was definitely something we heard about in the work that we did. Complexity, collective engagement, some beautiful words in here, but it's interesting that connection and truth and real are sort of standing out as the three biggest words there. So please feel free to keep adding your words. We'll share this word cloud after the webinar. But Simon, we might move to you and sort of, I think it's really nice to actually have that image to lead into this question, because I'd love to ask you about the different types of storytelling that you think about and use in your work at Purpose. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Absolutely, I'd love to. I mean, I think, and actually, I'll talk sort of an anecdote from a previous role I had. I ran an organization called FilmAid, which was an organization founded by film producers. It was initially created around the Kosovo crisis in 1999, and it was about bringing sort of psychosocial relief through mobile cinema, through stories to communities that have been displaced because of conflict. And then when I joined the organization, it primarily worked in refugee camps in Kenya. And I think like the point I want to make is like, we always take like a first principles approach. Like you take a step back and like, the question is like, what is the goal of your communication or your storytelling? Like, what are you trying to achieve? And in the context of FilmAid, like, there were multiple goals around it. Like at the core of what we did was teach filmmaking craft and storytelling skills to refugees and provide them with the tools that they could share their voice and have agency in their stories, and to give them the tools and the platform. So that led to, like making content that would be audio going out on local radio stations inside refugee camps. It would manifested as short films that would be shown on inflatable mobile cinema screens, or disseminated in some of the sort of cafes and restaurants within the refugee camp, where there was sort of the ability to show content off tapes. And so clearly there were goals there around like that, around sort of providing the tools and the capability and the capacity, right, and doing that training. But there was also goals related to the dissemination and the amplification of that content, because it was also about the stories that they were telling were connected to the issues that those communities were facing. And so there were stories and there was content around health communication, around various sort of other issues that affected them. And so therefore it became about also the dissemination of information that could create awareness and shift behaviors and address issues that were affecting the community, which also became a goal. So it was a bit like we were holding those two things, which was goals around the individuals who were telling the stories and the community was telling the story, but also around the audience. Like, what was the goal around the dissemination of that within that community, and what we're trying to achieve there. And I think that there's just a sort of focus around intentionality, right? Like, what are we trying to do? And it's fine to hold multiple things at the same time, right? You know, to hold the fact that you have maybe some core objectives, but there are going to be other sort of secondary objectives and things that come through your work. Now, if I look back to sort of like the work at MTV, and I look at like the work we do at Purpose, like it really follows that same sort of the same like approach. But it becomes much more about that amplification, right? So to that end, then we really look through the lens of one, the goals, the overarching goals we're trying to create, to have impact on, and then a lot around audience, right? So our understanding of audience and the role that audience can play. So the kind of work that I've been involved in and Purpose has been involved in cuts across behavior change communication, it cuts across narrative and sort of culture change communication. It looks at sort of policy and advocacy work. So how are we building support and constituency and community support for issues that creates political cover around issues to sort of build that will for decision makers to take action. So like there's the old adage, this is a classic adage, but like the things that we always think about is basically the 3 M's, which is message, messenger, and medium, right? Like it's critical. And I'm going to sort of tell a story of a piece of work that demonstrates when you get one of those things wrong, that things don't come together, right? And it doesn't work so effectively. And this story is from work that we did on climate change in Poland, where we had been working in Poland related to the fact that it was hosting the climate COP conference. It was a heavily coal-reliant country. Coal is like fundamentally like part of the national sort of identity, energy security, as a country that has been sort of invaded and been sort of geopolitical porn in many environments and over time and over history. So what we had there was a lot of climate work and environment work that was being undertaken by our like environmental organizations. But that message was not working within the political environment. It was connecting with progressive audiences and connecting with audiences that like, you know, were emotionally sort of connected and want to do something about the climate. But the current government at the time, the Law and Justice Party, was, you know, and is a right-wing government, and none of those messages were connecting with constituencies that could create the space for the government to actually start to move towards 100% renewable and to move towards net zero. And so we did a bunch of strategy to identify like which communities and constituencies we could mobilize, and landed on the Catholic community, particularly sort of conservative Catholic communities that are kind of a bedrock of support for the Law and Justice Party. So we had the context of like our strategy, our hypothesis, which is like, if we can connect with that audience with a message like delivered through messengers and through effective mediums that were going to meet them where they were, produce content like events, digital storytelling, like sort of surrounding those communities with that content, that we could actually mobilize audiences and create that platform. And the ingredients that we thought we had that were going to work, that didn't work, was that we had a pope who had just released the papal encyclical Laudato Si, and we had sort of connection into like some sort of Catholic community. So sort of like we built a platform there that we can engage with those groups, and it didn't work. The messaging didn't connect. It didn't mobilize. Didn't resonate. And what we did is we didn't sort of stop. We didn't say, okay, it hasn't worked, we'll move on, because our hypothesis we felt was still strong. We were just like, this message is not landing. And so that we did a bunch of testing, right, within those communities. And that was like in person, working with religious leaders, working with communities, as well as digital testing. So like, putting out storytelling to see what worked. And what we landed on was the fact that the message from the current Pope wasn't working. And actually the revered Pope in Poland is the Polish Pope, John Paul II. And so once we sort of captured that, we were able to look back at some of the writings and the theology of John Paul II to identify not where he was talking about climate change, but where he was talking about custodianship of the planet and the environment. And then we were able to sort of craft content and messaging with the community that then was successful in mobilizing communities and engaging with that. And then like we sort of mobilized a lot of sort of Catholic communities in the run up to the COP that took place there a few years ago. And it created a platform for the Law and Justice Party. It gave them the space, the political cover to be able to begin to make commitments to sort of pivot away from fossil fuels. So like that sort of anecdotally, I think like, gives a little story around how we think about like the different components of storytelling. The other pieces that come in that like clear things to think about are, one, the role of communities' voice within that. So the type of content that we're making, whose voices are there, who are our messengers, who are trusted individuals, both within community and those who have credibility and authenticity on an issue. And then a diversity of content. We don't live in a world where like mass media, my beginning of my career was MTV, mass media, top down. We just live in a much more fragmented information ecosystem. So we have to think in terms of diverse content that's going to reach those communities in different ways. But I will pause there. I don't know whether I've spoken for too long. Sorry, Thea.
No, fantastic. Thanks, Simon. Rachel, do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I think Simon's climate change example is a really good one that demonstrates why you need to successfully shift narratives to be able to shift systems, and stories are how you do that. So stories become an extremely vital piece of systems change. It's just not possible without that system of stories that underpins how humans think, behave and act, without stories to support that. And that climate change example is a really good example of how that can go wrong, but then how you can see what's going wrong and fix it and keep working at it.
That's great. Thanks, Rachel. And I think that segues really nicely into something I'd love to dive a little bit more deeply into, because obviously the work that we did with you earlier this year, late last year and early this year, was about the connection between stories and systems change. And obviously a lot of people here are from government or work around government, so are thinking about systems change from a government perspective as well. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing from your perspective in the system as a sort of philanthropist and and partner in this work, where you're working with lots of communities in many different ways to explore how stories change systems? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So a little bit about the forum. I realised I haven't really talked about it very much. We work with community-led initiatives that are demonstrating positive long-term change for young people and their families. These place-based initiatives are generally tackling the root causes of inequity by redesigning decision-making structures so that communities get more control over their lives and resources. When we started our exploration of storytelling with CPI and Hands Up Mallee, as an organisation, we were using storytelling really to share the work of our partner communities to wider audiences, which were primarily government and philanthropy, to gain more sustainable funding for their work, and to advocate for the practice and systems changes required to ensure that the impact these communities were having would be long-lasting. We really wanted to help communities build their own storytelling infrastructure so that they can tell their own stories of change and ensure that they're well resourced to do that. And that's how we came to work with the Centre for Public Impact and Hands Up Mallee Mildura to explore what good storytelling looks like, what gets in the way, and what's needed to be able to tell stories that are complex and highlight the role of systems change. And what we found through what we called listening sessions that brought together collective impact backbone teams, community members pursuing a community-led approach to change, storytelling experts, and those working in and around community-led systems change initiatives. We brought them together for a series of listening sessions, and our report, Storytelling for Systems Change, Insights from the Field, I'm sure it will be shared in the chat here, was the result. Sam Rye, one of the participants, explained that stories play different roles at different levels of the system. Stories can both support systems to change, but also shine a light on that change. In other words, stories can be used to change the system as well as evaluate, understand, and showcase the change that's occurring. We also know that systems change when people change how they relate to others, who they're in relationship with, and what they believe they're capable of doing. We heard that stories change the system by supporting people to build empathy with other perspectives. Dalit Kaplan from Storywell calls stories empathy machines. Stories help shift mindsets, teach and help us understand the world in different ways. As discussed by Skye, they can be used, the process of storytelling can be used to heal. It's transformational in itself. If people are transformed through the process of sharing stories, then the systems can be transformed. Stories are used to build new connections, relationships, like the model that I used to introduce myself this morning, and create conversations for change. We spoke to Rona Glynn McDonald from Common Ground and Tyson Yunka-Porter from Deakin University, who both highlighted how First Nations perspective stories can play a role in reshaping the rules of the system. Tyson explained that stories have a role to play in governance models and connecting everybody through common law, LORE. In a recent Stanford Social Innovation Review article by Brett Davidson, and I'll share that on the chat as well, he shares the insight that in order to achieve lasting systemic change, it isn't enough to change a few policies. These can be reversed or just not implemented in practice. We need to shift the underlying system of stories that help people make sense of the world. This requires greater investment in storytelling infrastructure, greater collaboration around narrative change, and more work to address the barriers that prevent communities from telling their own stories, so that millions of us can envision better and more humane systems and make them feel real. And that's something that we're really interested in exploring further at Dusseldorp Forum.
Thanks so much, Rachel. So I'm just conscious of time, and so there are a few audience questions that have come through, which I want to make sure that I get to. The first is from Sarah Rood, who has asked me to ask on her behalf, and she's asking both of you how you measure, not in numbers, the impact of your work or your campaign, Simon.
It's a great question, and I guess sort of first and foremost, it sort of depends on what you're trying to achieve. So the current work we do, it sort of cuts across a lot of different issues, and therefore, you know, we're trying to achieve different things. So we use a variety of approaches, and I think like the one of the key things is the understanding of like there's understanding our impact and how we measure that. But like that has two purposes, right? There's a purpose around accountability, right? What is the investment, and how do we know what impact we're having, and how can we report back on that? But like, as importantly, it's a feedback loop, because particularly when it comes to storytelling, particularly in the way that like it is a creative process, right? That some content works like better than other pieces of content, and so to have a learning process where you have feedback loops that is like telling you more about like, okay, how is that specifically working? How do we improve the way in which we're operating? Which is why like we call our sort of our infrastructure and our capacity around that impact measurement and learning, IML at purpose. And it's about actually designing those approaches around each of our campaigns and each of our stories. So it can be everything from surveys and qualitative sort of research approaches, both formative and sort of post-intervention, to understand like the impact those stories have had on community. It does include quantitative data as well, so understanding reach and depth and engagement around content, and then also thinking, depending on what we're working on, sort of anecdotal data around the kind of work we're doing. And it also acknowledgement that like you can't measure, like it's sometimes hard to measure things. Like, for example, I worked on counter human trafficking for many years, and like one, there's just a lack of data around numbers of people being trafficked, and two, you can't prove a negative. You can't prove when somebody has not been trafficked because of your intervention, right? So there's a complexity to it, but there are tools and methods that like you can deploy in order to sort of learn. Rachel, what do you think?
Yeah, so this is a really hot topic for us at the moment, because we're in the middle of a strategy review and the development of our next strategy. And we're really looking at, changing what we measure, essentially, to allow for what we think is more authentic reflection of what we're trying to achieve. We're looking at measuring our principles over, how we deliver on our principles, as opposed to just the outcomes of our partnerships. We're looking at things like deep listening, deep learning, deep collaboration, and deep thinking, and how you measure those things. And we're about to release a 5-year impact report. And we use something called the philanthropic benchmark as one type of measurement tool, which we go out to our partners and they come back with anonymous feedback around kind of processy type stuff about how we operate as an organisation. But we also do long form interviews with them. And they come back with stories of how they think, the way that we've worked with them has benefited their work or not benefited their work. And those stories have completely shaped our strategy. And it is that continuous feedback loop where we can go in and go, right, well, that relationship that we've got with that community needs work in this way. Measuring data is something, that we do and we have it, but it's not the most powerful thing that helps us be better. It's not the stories are what help us change our behaviour to be better partners.
Yeah, so I think that's actually a really nice lead into a question that Lola's put into the chat, which she's asked me to ask as well, because her internet is struggling. And I guess it's something that public servants really grapple with. So Lola has said that as a public servant, she agrees that storytelling is an important tool for creating change, but this needs to be balanced with evidence so that it's not getting too political. How do we know that we're getting the balance right and telling the right stories is her question. So interested in your views on that.
Rachel, do you want to go first?
I think that's that's what we're all grappling with. That's the, North Star, that's what we're aiming for. And that's got to be a collaborative goal amongst people working in this field to try and find that balance, I think. And that requires everyone to come together to work, together on this work. Like, we'd love to work more closely with government that are working with communities and place-based communities and look at what that balance looks like and how we can achieve that.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything needs to be more evidence-based. I think if the storytelling is about truth and authenticity of the individuals, right? I think that it's that's critical. I like, our work cuts across different categories. So some of our work is political, like it is around policy and advocacy, right? But some of our work is around behavior change and narrative shift, etc. And so I think there's a how do you it's like, in a world where we've done a significant amount of work of how we counter mis and disinformation. So we did a lot of work around COVID and continue to do a lot of work here, in fact, around the role of disinformation, particularly around the climate debate, obviously around COVID, around sort of vaccine and sort of public health information. And so we're working in an environment where there is coordinated mis and disinformation, particularly around the COVID crisis, and sort of how do we address that? So obviously, from a storytelling perspective, it's about science-based and evidence-based communication, but how do we package that in a way that is delivered by trusted messengers in a message that can connect with the audiences, and for a diversity of means that is addressing the challenge in certainly our digital ecosystem that is built to amplify more outrageous and sensational content, right? And so it is often sort of trained against what we're trying to do. And certainly it's trained against content that isn't sort of hitting those notes. So a lot of what we're trying to do is think about okay, how do we create engaging content, but that it's founded on evidence and it's sort of delivered through the right means.
Thanks, Simon. And I know I'm supposed to be hosting and not offering too many of my own opinions, but I can't help it on this one because this isn't a topic that I care quite passionately about. And I actually have written an article on the challenge with evidence-based policy making. And there are a few challenges, but the one that I care most deeply about is the reality that evidence is not neutral or objective. We sort of delude ourselves into believing that it is, but all research and evidence used by policymakers reflects, and we say this in the article, a particular set of generally unspoken and generally unacknowledged values, norms, and biases, which influence how studies are designed, which data are selected and which are not, which data are seen to be valid and which are not, and how that data is interpreted and applied. So I'll drop the link into the chat, but the sort of, we take inspiration from a group called Research in Practice, who talk about shift from evidence-based to evidence-informed policy making, which is around intentionally disrupting traditional power relationships around what forms of knowledge are more valid. So I think this is a really live topic for policymakers to start interrogating, what is good evidence and what does it look like. Now, I'm conscious that we've got another question from Catherine. Catherine has asked, what about using storytelling to reveal different perspectives on wicked problems? So there's sort of two parts to the question, but that question around using storytelling to, I guess, unpick some of the complexity. Simon and Rachel, I'm going to ask you to keep your answers to 1 minute each so that we can finish up on time. So how do we use storytelling to dig into complex, wicked challenges?
I'll be really quick. I think that is down to a diversity of storytellers, and there's some really good work being done by the Collective Change Lab, and I'll share their most recent video in the chat so you can have a look at it. But they're bringing together storytellers from around the world to demonstrate exactly how you do that kind of work.
Very little to add. Yeah, I mean, it's like the more we can amplify and provide spaces for different perspectives, it's critical. I think there's a lot to say around the media environment that people are consuming, and how that is skewed to a large degree. So we sit in our own little bubbles, right? And that's a challenge that we need to face. So there's no easy solution to the concept of diverse storytelling, because it's how does it reach its audience?
Absolutely. Well, I want to end now with a huge thank you to our panelists, Rachel and Simon and Skye, who unfortunately had to drop off. Thank you to you, our audience, for coming. This has been our second Reimagining Government webinar. We've got 2 more for this year. And we do love your feedback. So we continue to experiment with different models. So we'll send around a survey afterwards. Do let us know how this felt for you. Dalit Kaplan, who Rachel mentioned earlier, is actually going to be hosting a storytelling workshop for our community of practice members later in July, on the 28th of July. That's a free workshop for anyone to attend. So if you want to be part of that, click on that link in the slide and join our community of practice, or you can also email my colleague, Kira. Our next webinar, which is going to be on the 22nd of September, is going to be exploring ideas and case studies around how government and the for-purpose sector can better partner with and learn from First Peoples. The panel is going to be announced soon, so watch this space. And we will send an email in the next couple of weeks, which will have details about both that community of practice storytelling workshop, as well as the next webinar, as well as a short wrap-up blog from today. So thanks again to everyone for joining us. A huge thanks also to the behind the scenes efforts of Shannon, who makes this all work so smoothly. And we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you again in a few months' time.